Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read about Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Two-Way Mirror by Fiona Sampson, about Elizabeth Barrett Browning. By the time she was 12, the expression captured by the well-known portraitist William Attad had become meltingly sweet. It's a good look with which to disarm critics of female precocity. Though he accustomed to spending time with distinguished and highly able members of the establishment, Artaud certainly falls for it. He tells a friend that Ba possesses an extraordinary genius. She has a command of language and idea that is quite marvelous, and her versification is sufficiently varied and harmonious. She absorbed the learned languages as free and as rapidly as chalk does water. She is also the ingenious simplicity and airy volatility of spirits and the most sprightly of her age and sex. She is idolized by her parents, and yet such is the excellence of her disposition that I think she is not in the least danger of being spoiled. Perhaps a girl of the age of puberty wears the precocity lightly because she is used to it. With her mother's guidance since she was 8, she has been reading big-scale texts full of ethical arrangement. Alexander Pope's translation of the Iliad, Shakespeare's Othello and The Tempest, passages from John Milton's Paradise Lost. She was only 8 when she received a 10-shilling note to reward from some lines on virtue written for her father. His delighted response addressed her as Poet Laureate of Hope End. She took this compliment seriously as only a little girl who adores her papa can, and resolved that she would be a proper laureate, producing odes for every domestic occasion. Unlike most 8-year-olds, though, Ba kept her resolution. She wrote a second poem to her father just 3 days later. The next month, she saw verses for her mother's birthday and for Henrietta's, but now you have a horrid cold, and an ugly nightcap you are rolled, and the sonnet celebrating the recovery of little Arabella from a dangerous illness. When death's pale hand o'er baby spread, the pillow raised her little head, her face was white, her pulse beat low. From every eye and tears did flow. This, it seems, a little morbid and perhaps not surprising. Papa's accolade came just 5 weeks after Mary's little death, and these first family poems are written through the ensuing period of mourning at Hope End and during the family's north trip. However seriously Ba takes her own poems, occasionally verse is in fact another of the family's things. Her grandmother, Graham Clark, writes accomplished poetry, and over the years, Ba's siblings and Mama will try their hand at it too. Like the family nicknames, these rhymes play with languages as something shared, a kind of insider speak and a domestic magic for using words to build a shared understanding of something. Ba was never quite shake off. Years from now, a distinctly Victorian alignment with the people at home will remain close to her heart of her adult work. Meanwhile, when she gets to 14, Ba looks back at this 8-year-old self. First found real delight in poetry, too young to feel the loveliness of simple beauty, I required something dazzling to strike my mind, the brilliant imagery of fine metaphors and flowing numbers. At 9, I felt such pleasure from effusions of my imagination in the adorned drapery of versification. At this age, work's imagination only afforded me gratification. At 10, my poetry was entirely formed by the style of written authors that I have read and I might write. These memories come from glimpses of my own life and literary character, one of 3 notebook self-portraits, but composes in a burst of adolescent self-consciousness between the age of 12 and 15. Perhaps naively, she cites John Locke's foundational 1618 work of philosophical empiricism, an essay concerning human understanding, to argue that she's not being vain. Self-examination can bring us great advantage in directing our thoughts in the search of other things. Precocious or not, her self-scrutiny is typical of the teenage girl and varied toward the excessively self-critical. My character and Bros compare, that's her brother, her younger brother, Bro, is peppered with judgments like ardent, enthusiastic, impatient, and not content till I excel, which is disinterested observer right recognized as signs of an unusual intelligence struggling with being forced to go at trotting pace. Still, this 14-year-old is guided more by emotional intuition than rational proposition. I feel uncomfortable contempt for any little littleness of mind or meaningless of soul, and I prejudiced, I detest, profess a patriotism enthusiastic and sincere, and claims to understand little of theology, although at 12 she passed through a phase of enthusiastic vision, since regretted. She's also capable of touchingly straightforward adolescent angst, a society I'm pretty much the same as other people, only much more awkward and much more wild and much more mad. But behind all this, there's a nagging sense of talent being wasted, of a mind consuming itself. Idyllic through life at Hope End is far from being stretched. Ba is being held back a year by sharing lessons with Bro, her younger brother, who, though by no means deficient, has no chance in competition with her. As William Attad put it, youthful intelligence must find its own way, and does so chiefly through reading. At 11, I wished to be considered an authoress. Novels were thrown aside. Poetry and essays were my studies, and I felt my most ardent desire to understand the learned languages. Ba starts Latin, her first learned language, in 1816, having begun French a few months earlier. The following summer, she takes up Greek with her classics tutor, who was officially brought in for Bro, finding I like this language a lot because I will be able to read Plato and of all great authors of Greece, and not just read. Within a couple of years, I will be composing her first Greek ode. For now, though, it is still childish tactlessness that she admonishes her Uncle Sam. I'm astonished that you don't want to travel to Greece, where you can take one more instruction or more pleasure than from the Balkan monuments, which are the tombs of the greatest people in the universe. But after all, she's only 11. What's more, she's writing in French under the tutelage of a Madame Gordon, who comes in twice a day and sets correspondence as homework. It would be difficult to take such an arrangement in rural Herefordshire, but the family are spending summer in 1817, a newly fashionable Ramsgate. Much to Ba's irritation, this Kent seaside resort was also producing a dancing master. I don't like dancing at all. Her mind is on higher things. She's already composing French and Latin verse. Sitting in my house under the sideboard in the dining room, concocting one of the soliloquies beginning, Que sujet auto français en general romain, Montaigne enclave de Carthage, je souffre in vain. As she shall recall decades of now in a vignette of her 10-year-old self, still playing house under the furniture of the adult world at the same time as she plunges determinedly out of her depth. This is touching, funny, and priggish. Talent as Ba's privilege, and her Achilles heel. At 14, when Bro goes away to school, she becomes doubly anguished by the loss of her closest companion and her own exclusion from education, perhaps triply so, as sexless tomboy freedom is exchanged for a young woman's body that will handicap so many of her pleasures. Through the whole course of my childhood, I find a steady indignation against nature, who made me a woman, and I am determined resolution to dress up in men's clothes as soon as I was free of the nursery and go into the world to seek my fortune. Poor Beth, she'll write later, slippingly, discreetly into third person, I had one great misfortune. She was born a woman. Now she's despised nearly all the women in the world. She could not abide their likeliness, called delicacies, this pretty headaches and soft mimicking voices, their nerves and affections. One word Beth hated in her soul, and the word was feminine. Ba is articulating here the frustration of generations of women who hate not their bodies and their own selves, but the considerations of gender roles. There are pleasures and there are pinch points, and we should be careful about reducing such resistances to aspects of femininity to the single-pointed essentialism of gender dysphoria. The real woman couldn't possibly feel like this, at a claim made by centuries of misogynists. Ba is growing up in an era when even the daughters of the wealthy must rely on paternal goodwill and culture to patch together an education beyond the feminine accomplishments she's bored by. I hate needlework and drawing because I never feel occupied whilst I work or draw. Her father keeps a country gentleman's library, a cosmopolitan affair. A British education at the start of the 19th century is well stocked with the classics, key establishment, belles lettres, and some of the romantics. With her mother's guidance at her early teens, she has read the American revolutionary thinker Thomas Paine, Locke's fellow British empiricist, David Hume, the great French secularist, Voltaire, a translation from the German of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, The Sorrows of Young Werther, arguably the most influential Bildungsroman in European history, and that Genevan-born romantic was a more political take on the nature of the self, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. She's such a great admirer of 13 of Mary Wollstonecraft's The Vindication of the Rights of Women that 2 years later her mother is worrying Mrs. Wollstonecraft's system will turn her into an old maid with singleness of will, etc. Yet if Mamas herself will give Bob permission to read Wollstonecraft at this formative age, the surrendered wife imagined by future biographers is nothing like the real woman viewed by her contemporaries as Mary and her little courtier of independent females, ambition for her children's development as she who keeps them at their lessons when Papa is away on business and who commissions and collects much of Ba's juvenile creativity, including a fragmentary essay on women written at 16 in response to Alexander Pope's essay on man. Are vases only prized because they break? Then why must women be loved by weak? But it's not just femininity that's engaging Ba's emergical political awareness. Turn back once more to 1817 when we find the 11-year-old drafting a furious letter to Lord Somers, owner of the nearby Esnor Castle, who is a neighborhood chagrin, is about to be made Lord Lieutenant of Herefordshire and will begin in earldom. He is among House of Lords supporters for the government's suspension of habeas corpus, the right to be tried in one's own presence, and therefore fairly, on the grounds that there are too many political subversives around. Moreover, his pamphlet, A Defense of the Constitution of Great Britain, published this same year, argues that the right to vote should be curtailed. Parliament doesn't need to sit every year. Ba's fiery letter denouncing his attacks on liberty can be done neighborly relations much good if it was ever actually sent, but she doesn't seem to notice the paradox inherent in the arguing for legal and dramatic rights as a daughter and granddaughter of slave owners. She's not alone in this. Her slave father and Uncle Sam are both in the same political progressive Whigs in youthful idealism, in political in particular, always separated by a few degrees from daily life. Ever since her very first poem on the cruelty of forcemen of man, she protested press ganging liberty has been a recurring theme for Ba. The high point of her early seriousness is the Battle of Marathon, a 1,500-line retelling of the heroic couplets she's coming to favor as a key moment in the Greco-Persian Wars. Her preface frames the story not as an adventure, but as a moral parable about one little city rising undaunted and daringly her innumerable enemies in deference to her freedom, and it's surely better to hold such ethical ideals than not. How then do we judge a younger person who develops a social conscience before she knows all the facts and has the economic and social agency to act? It's unclear how well informed Ba is about the sources of her family's wealth as she enters her teens, but the Battle of Marathon has cost her too much effort and emotion to be a game. Started in the summer, she was 11. It takes her over 2 years to complete. Her father, the dedicatee, has it printed in a private edition of 50 copies for her 14th birthday. Through this is Vanity Publishing. It is her first book and some of the strongest passages of her precociously adult, assured ear, as when Ba brings Athena to Athens to give false counsel. Down clouds the goddess breast, she calls her car, and lightly sweeps the liquid fields of air, when sable nights miss nature's silent nature springs, and o'er Athena takes her drowsy wings, the Paphian goddess from Olympus flies, and leaves the starry senate of the skies. Still, even the most austerely intellectual young girl enjoys high days and holidays, but plays Ba puts on with her siblings and undeniably literary achievements that first French tragedy, as succeeded by Socrates of the Laurels of Athens when she's 11, the tragedy of Laertes when she's 13, and organizing the straggle of little siblings to perform much of the chaotic fun too. There are trips to join Grandmama and Treppy at the smart new spa town of Chesilham, just 20 miles away, and when Ba was 9, she managed to invite herself along to her parents' expedition to France simply by dint of jumping into their carriage with them. Yet this turned out to be the most intellectually formative of treats, traveling by way of Calais, Bologna, Aberville, and Amiens. The family followed a trail to ecclesiastical architecture in Paris, where they spent 3 weeks at the Hotel of Rivoli, with French windows opening upon the Treilel Gardens of Palace. Ba and her mother frequented the nearby Louvre, the most magnificent thing in the world, I am sure, and the garden and the Jardin des Plantes, where they joined Uncle Sam and went through him to the Theatre Francaise and the Opera Comique, where returning to the England via Rouen, and they viewed another cathedral and the spot where Joan of Arc was burned at the stake. It was part of Ba's lifelong fascination with Europe that fueled her desire to learn languages. It was also differed markedly from the languors of life back home. Hope End, in the spite of the romantic prospects which environ it, on the spite of the beauty of beholding nature wrapped in the bridal robe, which as we have is present, is dull and is lonely. The sun rolls over our heads. No papa is here to greet us. This is a fascinating glimpse of how important her father's charisma is to the creation of her happy home. For this very idyllic is part fantasy and part Hope End in particular is being built with blood money. For to an even greater extent than Graham Clark's, Barrett's wealth comes from sugar plantations. Ba's father was born Edward Barrett Moulton at Cimarron Hill in St. James, Jamaica in May 1585 and spent first 5 years in the elegant 18th century great house overlooking Montego Bay. It's a beautiful spot among aromatic cinnamon trees that by the 1970s will be seductive enough for country and western star Johnny Cash to move in. The estate that surrounded young Edward, though, was one of several sugar plantations owned by his maternal grandfather, Edward Barrett, and worked by enslaved people. Edward's mother was a Barrett, her father was a Moulton, and when he was 13 and living in England, he and his brother added a second Barrett to their names in order to inherit from their maternal grandfather, who by then had neither surviving sons nor other legitimate grandchildren. As it had said with the Clark estate, money wanted to follow the family name. Once again, there was required a complex process involving the royal warrant. That John Graham Clark was on hand to guide the youth through this suggests that he might even have proposed the idea. He was already planning a dynastic marriage when later that same year the teenage Edward's grandfather died. He left them 84,000 acres of sugar plantation, where about 2,000 people were enslaved, a substantial legacy indeed. The Barretts seemed to believe something to be of mixed heritage. Percy Barrett, Ba's 4 times great-grandfather, arrived in Jamaica on 1655, an officer in the army that captured it from Spain. As a reward in 1663, King Charles II granted him land a colonist, then but not yet a slave owner. Subsequent generations, however, changed this, and in the intervening century and a half had been plenty long enough for the kinds of consensual and non-consensual relationships across ethnic divides, both acknowledged and otherwise, that produce both mixed heritage populations and long colonized societies. When she's nearly 40, Ba will write to her lover when she herself has the blood of a slave. I would give 10 towns in Norfolk, if I had them, to own some pure lineage and that of the blood of a slave. Cursed are we from generation to generation. I seem to have the combination service. This letter has been quoted, including by commentators who believe that it displays not anxiety about heritage, but right-minded abolitionist guilt. But the racist phrasing is clear. From pure lineage, then that of the blood addresses ethnicity, not the blood of the family's hands. And that combination service, already almost obsolete in Elizabeth's lifetime, tries to ward off divine punishment, not so many for any particular sin as for the original sin of being born. Internalized racism is a Baroque falsehood. Shame is a complex, unreasonable emotion, and shame and anxiety about something understood as one's very identity of both profoundly unreasonable. No one can help how they're born, and particularly complex because it concerns what is unescapable from a 21st century perspective through Barrett mixed heritage would be brilliant news. How exciting if a cultural game changer like Elizabeth Barrett Browning will become proves to have broken open not only the male canon from the canon of white writing too, which is why it's important to be careful with the actual record facts. Disappointingly, Ba's closest relatives, whose mixed heritage is certain aren't people she's actually descended from, but are lateral kin, second cousins who are the children of Grandmama's prolific brother, George Goodwin Barrett. 3 years later, after Papa and his siblings arrived in Britain, the second illegitimate set of Edward Barrett's grandchildren made the same Atlantic crossing. Their mother, Alyssa Peters, was of mixed heritage. She had been enslaved until her death of her late owner, to whom she had given by her father. When George Goodwin died, when she was freed and sent with her 6 children by him from John Graham Clark to be settled in Newcastle under the terms of their father's will, they were not fixed their abode in Jamaica, but do settle and reside in such countries where their distinctions respecting color are not maintained. Their optimistic construction of race relations in the early 19th century Tyneside all too conveniently tidies the children away from their late father's property. The roots of Barrett privilege are in shallow soil. The family are paradoxically placed as beneficiaries in the very racism that causes them such anxiety. The customer's behavior of the Jamaican plantocracy does indeed make mixed heritage somewhat in the branching tree of their ancestors a reasonable hunch, but hunches aren't history. Nevertheless, as race is at least particularly a social construct, not a set of essentialist eugenical capacities, shouldn't we count it as a kind of victory for 19th century black writing that a woman who was relatively good reason believes herself to be a mixed heritage achieves literary superstardom before 1850? For Elizabeth is certainly not doing what later generations will call blacking up, and that promiscuously much quoted in the fact very private letter to her lover. On the contrary, she's confessing a secret. If Ba has already encountered difficulty in imagining herself into the role of woman poet, imagining herself as black woman poet must be, for her time and class, almost unthinkable. The only precursor for 40-year-old who writes this letter must have heard of is as Phyllis Wheatley, the African-born poet who was raised as a slave in Boston, Massachusetts, and created a sensation in 1773 when she moved on London and published a poetry collection, poems in various subjects, religious and moral, under the patronage of the Countess of Huntingdon. She is in way an Elizabeth Barrett Browning's alter ego, the kind of outlier, impossibly best case chance, Elizabeth might have said if she had been born enslaved, later admired for her classicalism in her own time, much as Wheatley's celebrity is based precisely on the perceived anomaly of her gifts. These poems display no astonishing work of genius, but when we consider them as the productions of a young, untutored African who wrote them after 6 months carefully studying of the English language, we cannot but express our admiration. The exception is often viewed as an impostor, but the Barrett family disease is an imposter syndrome. Ba's father was only briefly exposed to the hurly-burly of school, sent to Harrow at 12, and left abruptly within a year. In the family version that will be passed down by Robert Browning, he was humiliatingly bullied by an older pupil for whom he was supposed to fag, that is, act as servant. Such bullying is endemic, indeed structural, to famous boys' schools of the time, condoned as a way to knock the corners off spoiled youngsters, teach discipline, and help them internalize the potency of hierarchy. Papa certainly has faith in hierarchy. A decade into Ba's idyllic first Hertfordshire summer, he sends his 2 eldest sons to Charterhouse, even though he himself not cope at school. But with that, what exactly was he, for example, flogged like a slave, as many he have experienced it? He said to be dark complexioned like Ba. Was there racism in the abuse? Or more complex, might his family have feared an element of racism in the family version of older boy who punished the teenager allegedly for burning his toast was expelled? How hard did Harrow try to soothe a pushy colonial family? Whatever happened, both brothers were withdrawn from the school, and although Edward Barrett, Moulton Barrett, went up to Trinity Hall, Cambridge at 16, his corners clearly never were knocked off. By the time he got to the university, he must also have had stifling sense of his fatherless family as dysfunctional. Unlike his brother Sam, Papa will never return to Jamaica, the place where their own father scandalously separated from or possibly even deserted them and their mother. For Ba's paternal grandfather, Charles Moulton, left the family soon after his third son had been conceived. Worse, his brother Robert Moulton later defrauded Papa, the eldest of the three, up to £30,000, asserting that Charles had given him power of attorney and laying claim to manage Edward's estate while he was still a minor. Despite all this, Charles has made some contact. By the time Ba turned 7, he is living in England. Land tax records of 1812 and 13 show him residing at Epsom. Survey is the house belonging to the Barretts, but Ba never meets this misquoting grandparent. The begging letter he sends her father in this period elicits a brisk rebuttal. Still, his trickster figure resurfaces periodically in the history of Parliament, where he earns a mention when his second son, Uncle Sam, serves as MP of Richmond, Yorkshire, and becomes a merchant of Hammersmith and New York. In fact, he seems to hail from the island of Merdia, nearly 700 kilometers off the coast of Morocco, whose population at the time of his birth comprised primarily of descendants of early Portuguese settlers and slaves from Guinea, Algeria, and the Canary Islands. However, as this is Ba, many years in the future she'll fall in love with a man who terms of endearment for this brown-eyed, dark-haired woman included the little Portuguese, a pet name eventually to be immortalized in the title of her Sonnets of the Portuguese, but her feelings about the part of the family history are mixed. From childhood, Elizabeth Barrett Moulton Barrett signs herself EBB, omitting the initial M because I fell into the habit of forgetting that I was a Moulton altogether. She published her breakthrough book, Poems, in 1844, Elizabeth Barrett Barrett. If Ba's internalized racism whispers that her ancestry continues the taint, there's just a faintest hint of another taint too, one she may not even be aware of. Perhaps it is not surprising that with the not disinterested John Graham Clark increasingly replacing other mentors, Edward Barrett Moulton Barrett rushed into early marriage, but there's an additional whiff of haste about this wedding, which took place on May 14th, 1805, a fortnight shy of her 20th birthday, and was announced only respectively when Ba was born as early as seasonally possible as 42 weeks later on March 6, 1806. Her father was still a couple of months short of his own legal majority. Her first brother, Bro, followed her with remarkable speed the following June, and such reproductive activity reminds us of how young a father Edward is. But there is another possibility. Mary and Edward married in style despite the haste in the newly consecrated fashionable St. Nicholas Church, Gosforth. Given this and the local findings of Mary's family, it's somewhat surprising that when baby Ba arrives, she's christened privately at just 3 days old on March 9th, 1806. No evidence survives to suggest that she particularly frail. Noticeably, this firstborn isn't celebrated with a holiday in the family plantations, though firstborn Bro will be. And when she's christened on February 10th, 1808, the 2-year-old Ba is rechristened in public alongside him. It's almost as if she smuggled into the world. Her private christening is conducted by a good friend who just happens to be visiting the new parents this week. William Lewis Ram, a Cambridge friend of Edward's, is on the way of becoming a leading agriculturist. He's also the rector of a parish far out of the sight and mind of Wiltshire. His doubtless delight is inspected the agricultural potential of the estate his friend has recently rented, Coxhoe Hall in County Durham, but it must be odd and embarrassing for the young unmarried priest to coincide with, if not an actual birth, when the lying in that followed it. On the other hand, with the relatively little experience of infants, Ram would be the perfect choice for officiant if one of anything questionable, to cover up, such as, say, a baby who appears less than newborn than 3 or 4 months old, which raises the question, could this conscientiously precocious Ba be in fact been born a little earlier than the recorded birth date, so perilously soon after her parents' hasty marriage, and so close at less than 16 months to Bro's arrival? Whatever the case, for all the wealth, by July 1810, Ba's 25-year-old papa has already plenty of reasons to feel insecure. A broken home, immigration, anxieties about ethnicity and class, compromised wealth, early marriage, and possibly accidental fatherhood, manipulation by an absent father, his father, brother, and his father-in-law, with so little to rely on. The psyche needs the compensatory structures. Small wonder he's throwing so much money and energy into creating his ideal home. Hope End House, finished this year. He turns 32, is a young man's indulgence. The Barrett Circle is more interesting in extracting merchandise and money from Jamaica than any kind of magpie culturalism, cultural Orientalism that Queen Victoria's imperial reign will soon popularize. Yet this great statement is built in the very newest Orientalist style, with its minarets, ogre drop-shaped windows, and second-floor roundels. It is more than a little in common with the fashionable picturesque, that's newest cultural trend for strikingly ornamental from whimsical forms of planting and building, for which Herefordshire friends and neighbors will turn out to be the intellectual powerhouse. Edward Barrett, Moulton Barrett, doesn't employ an architect, simply turning a landscape architect, J.C. Loudon, who is redesigning the grounds, for occasional advice. The result is a fashionably expensive piece of outer-sider art. The house being built in 1810 below Ba's Parkland viewpoint looks like the folly it is, yet it has a disconcerting, gaudy-like sense of fluidity. The building pushes and pulls old Palladian proportions to create a flowing modern structure, and whose whole century ahead of its time, but it amplifies the original gesture of relegating the old Georgian mansions and so resembled Cinnamon Hall to a stable block, seemed deeply personal. Freudian logic seems to be trumpeting economic and aesthetic sense. Perhaps unsurprisingly, in 1873, a subsequent owner will pull everything down and start over again. But for the space of Ba's childhood, the house that Papa built represents everything that's prodigious, expansive, and progressive, and everything defensive and compromised about the Barretts. Risk-taking, pioneering, fundamentally domestic, and not a little vulgar, Hope End may be the monument to invention as survival strategy and precursor to adult Bob's own sui generis creativity. In other words, when Papa built Hope End for Ba, that created her creativity. See how important a child's environment and her education is? Well, we'll pray for peace and continue these lessons on in antebellum America so we can pray for the education of the children of the world and pray for peace in the world. Have a good day.